Federation Interstellar and Pleiadian. Friends and students, this is one of the ancient texts available for study. Its stellar political game between the various groups of Pleiades, their different races and interests, in addition to exiled groups of settlers and researchers who came to Earth and eventually genuinely experienced their incarnational process. A point to be clarified is related to two factions that have been assembled and supported to date within the delegations from the Pleiades constellation. Initially should understand that Pleiades is a constellation of stars 350, within a cluster of dust and semi-open star cloud. A real stars and planets cradle several qualifications. Within this structure there are several breeds that use space technology and other technology. This group would form at the United Federation of Planets within this conglomerate and would later be attached to the Intergalactic Federation, which already had members from other star systems and constellations. However, within the power struggles between the Adamic race of Aryan and the Semitic due to wars, it's over creating two political factions. Therefore, the Federation Pleiadian is related to the Aryan race of Aryan that in 3D to 5D formatted the reality of the new Pleiadian Empire. The structure did not recognize in full the suitability of the Interstellar Federation and the United Planets, precisely for reasons of racial political order. Differences in political order were actually based on pre-concept related to racial differences in the various ethnic groups that have controlled the technological power and colonial within this constellation. There were many forms of life beyond human, they were already holding their respective duality and co-creational power within what we could put as harmonious and disharmonious. This has generated competitiveness and with it the power struggle and the natural desire to enslave their competitors, which would lead to war and clashes in several respects. The Pleiades conglomerate holds to date racial ethnic groups of insectoid beings and derivations winged long before the emergence of the human species. This made the duality and disputes through space within the settlements of the Aryans and Dracos become very complex and full of power struggle situations and wars for possession of planets and technology of beings who existed before them. Thus the internal history of this conglomerate is much deeper than is reported in the books channeled the emissaries of the Pleiades. This factor alone has helped to shape groups of indoor federations in stellar conglomerate while different political positions within the history of internal people. Thus, the Federation Pleiadian eventually format from the people internal and not external as many people imagine, precisely because there are many stellar associations. In fact, each constellation created in the process to develop an equivalence to interplanetary United Federation of Planets attached. Only with time these groups eventually format that you must understand the Interplanetary Federation. This, in turn, was eventually annexed by the Federation Interstellar Galactic, which already had many stellar groups within their political and military formatting. Elsewhere in parallel there were trade houses that had the protection of the different federations and colonial interests expansion. Within Pleiades there were about 4 groups of power, E4 federations so set with command power and dispute planets and different political interests, which competed commercially exploring different worlds. These 4 federations had access to about 640 planets and stars within the conglomerate, from which ended extracting minerals and basic resources for its expansion. These worlds were within the conglomerate and represented their tangible universe of 3D-7D. The resources that exist therein form the basis for the technological and spiritual operational process of the various groups of the time acting. This conglomerate were contained stellar communication portals to other locations, only later to be exploited by groups that had achieved greater spiritual and scientific perception of the other parallel realities themselves. Due to the particular genetic condition existing in Adamic fractal Aryan and Semites Draco derivatives of the experiment, these two groups over time on them, just reigning in the evolutionary scale and distinguished from other groups. Over time the genetic experiments and natural selection ended up creating a greater connection with people from Pleiades and joining the groups, but for this before, many wars were necessary. The Draco ended up in his experiments led by Satan, by absorbing DNA and the genome of other internal people from Pleiades, to generate with that another independent race, that was to evolve the insectoid and winged beings, as well as a branch of amphibians. These experiments emerged beings variations linked to aquatic worlds and deep connections with mestizo races with dolphins and certain types of whales. In this process also races with winged human genetic drift ended up formatting within a well-evolved scale in a short time. All these groups eventually attached to the interests of the Internal Site Federation. However, the Aryan groups eventually remain isolated and only a small portion of them ended up attending these genetic projects. Most created its own timeline and entered into a parallel reality to no more wars and no political involvement with other groups. Thus, the Aryans eventually found his own Pleiadian Federation which turned out to remain isolated. Although contact with the other federations, they maintained their own authority and political isolation. This process took a while parallel to the development of the Earth in 3D plans of the 7D, creating realities in parallel to both places. Both federations put on Earth genetic materials and colonization groups, to generate life and give continuity to it a broad spectrum of political and social interests. The Earth is actually an interesting planet because its orbit within the 260,000 years of displacement in the path, passing through the vicinity of the Alcyone star, which is precisely the brightest of the Pleiades. Within the approach orbit, the Earth received materials and product of the Pleiades groups on several occasions, including your satellite Lunar, which is actually a great ship orbiting the Pleiadians, with hundreds of bases and technical facilities of the Dracos groups and Semites. This turned out to insert an increase of duality in the course of political disputes of the residence groups in exile on Earth. Luhara was initially the Pleiadian name given to your satellite for various reasons of linguistic derivation ended up calling the Moon. The Earth got its satellite to establish a stable orbit around the Sun Monmatia when occurred the galactic wars Pleiades, and this led to the destruction of some worlds and orbital imbalance of various stars. The passage of a planet of dimensions equivalent to near Jupiter's orbit between Earth and Mars, turned out to have serious seismic changes on Earth. Thus, at the time, the Moon was artificially inserted to stabilize the Earth's orbit and at the same time insert a permanent operating base around the Earth and in the Solar System, as is the case to date. This planet has been lost from its original orbit. It turned out to be absorbed by the Taurus Aldebaran system long after and remains within the influence of this star. He had a well-developed Draco and human civilization which remained in the depths of this planet and created a 4D civilization in its journey through space to be absorbed by Aldebaran. The star of this trip took about 350 million years land to be absorbed and have its stable orbit. During this period, there were many generations that it developed in different lines of maturing and technology and understanding of the universe and divinity. In Earth time, the coupling of the Moon occurred about 353 million years land if they are analyzed by the aspect of linear time for you, which is actually a very big mistake, because the events within the stellar order cannot be accounted for by the linear chronology of time. This was long before the destruction of Maldek planet lying between Jupiter and Mars, where currently you have an asteroid belt. So within that time you are analyzing, the Earth and your solar system have passed hundreds of times by Alcyone's orbit. The distance that your solar system travels near Alcyone is around 1.4 light-years away that star, so very close, generating respectable orbital and gravitational interference. This generates a profound change of life cycle every passage for all involved. So for all the inhabitants of the planets involved, this occurrence is actually an important quantum leap in the evolutionary scale, and in the following designs the process, which lasts about 13,000 years land when the proximity is quite striking between the two solar systems. The orbit of the solar system also passes near Sirius and Ptolemy, thus creating the connection path of the 49 planets and stars connected to Pleiadian Federation that is formatted within the political interests of the Pleiades groups and their former colonizers, as is the case Ariano Alpha group and some Beta Sirius groups. The presence of the Moon was an important factor in the negotiations and the Pleiades of influence within these 49 worlds. The order of 49 starts in this political situation, when the presence of the Earth's Moon was the basis to place the interests of Pleiadians within 49 planetary systems during the orbital trajectory of Monmatia solar system. The colonial process of planet Nibiru, where the Anunnakis are well founded, occurred from the Draco's transfer traveler planet that was lost and absorbed by Aldebaran. Many things ended up choosing Nibiru because of the level playing field and distance within the trajectory of approach between the two planets. This is due to the fact that Nibiru's orbit drilled at 30 degrees the equatorial axis of your solar system, which meant that at the time of transfer, Nibiru was almost in the Earth's point of intersection about 8 astronomical units, thus allowing transshipment for ships of more than 20,000 refugees to Nibiru. This would create a civilization of Nibiru and the subsequent race of Anunnakis. This factor turned out to strengthen the interests of the Pleiadian Federation in exchanges with other worlds. The portion relating to the Sirians generated deep interest because Sirius had been partly responsible for the colonization of Pleiades and had sent a number of delegations, and the highest political echelon Sirius Alpha, Pleiades was a colony protected by Sirian interests and several of the Federation agreements Sirian, who was negotiating attached Pleiades star within other political groups, to strengthen its position on the groups of Antares and Shala, both of Scorpio. This relationship was later to have Sirius influence policies against Sirius, because of what was called confluence Antares or convergence for more than 1 million Sirian years. However, long before that occurs, there were political tensions between the Scorpion insectoid and human Sirius. We must remember that Sirius has other races beyond human species. Reptiles and insectoid also part of the protected people and annexed by the Sirian Federation of the time. These beings eventually be part of the colonial groups that were entered in the Pleiades during the expeditions. Thus, the 49 worlds eventually be part of a natural transfer sheet of the solar system orbit. Within the timeline of the 5D being 7D of the time, the 260,000 years that your solar system takes to move through its orbit are insignificant and strategic for the development of arrays of life and the necessary changes in the genome of each race that was being experienced by Lanonadic Order and other groups of stellar interest. The mesh of the control matrix between 3D and 7D begin to settle in this scenario, due to the exile of problems of various groups for the 49 worlds and at the same time, the interference of Satan and his collaborators, for all had deep interests in development of several genetic and political affairs. Groups of Orion Rigel had deep interest in the group of 49 due to the involvement of various breeds and genetic projects. The Anunnakis were an example of this, as they were Satan's design and theory within the Pleiades that was being monitored since his departure Traveler planet. In addition, the presence of Regalians in different worlds of the 49 planets, generated the presence of many reptilian and insectoid within that group. All beings who have just, somehow, for a presence on Earth within its colonial history. The Interstellar Federation, in fact, turned out to settle and develop the political interconnection of the 49 worlds and other conglomerates that had political and colonial interests within the group of 49. The birth of various colonial groups. Each group represents a different colonial planetary structure, which aims to sectoral development of different genetic arrays. Each matrix was developed by Lanonadic Order to not only colonial goals, but research and other interests in the genetic and psychological aspect of each study of the existing genome. Exiles arrive to Earth. There are about 89,000 years to reign, arrive on Earth beings who were exiled from other worlds, who had gone through a very marked duality process. These beings ever came to Earth in a similar process, but in more subtle planes. One of these beings turned out to be negative to extreme levels of evil and magic in pursuit of meaningless power. They eventually form that which could be defined as Kakria as inharmonious to their material universe and everything that was in the foreign and domestic. Within these beings we can mention the groups of 3 ethnic groups in the Chapel Star, which in turn were descendants of the colonial process of the Pleiades constellation. The beings that were inserted into the worlds of Chapel 406 were exiled from colonial Pleiadian process among the Semites and the Aryans and another mestizo group of them, which was close to the star Alcyone between 4D to 6D. These beings participated in the Great War of the Pleiades and Orion, and are part of duality process and format of the Pleiadian Federation policy and stellar this quadrant. The time when this occurred in the Earth is not linear scale, but can be framed in terms that approximate about 1.2 to 1.6 million years. These 3 power groups came from the evolutionary process of the ancient beings of the star Vega and Lyra colonies, who for various reasons chose the Pleiades as an escape point and new life. However, their problems have continued due to their choices. Their exile selection to Chapel 4, 06 occur for various reasons within the evolutionary natural selection that was formatting the different matrices of consciousness. Chappell had ideal conditions in 4D to proceed with the proposal of these groups of about 3 million beings. In addition, the star of Chappell also received quadrant of exile, being the star of Orion, Saiph, Rigel and also Bul Aldebaran, with a total volume of approximately 8 million beings who should between 4D-5D begin a new stage evolutionary, while a continuity to what was proposed before in the world and had been unable to consolidate. Chappell transferred to the terrestrial orb about 6 million exiles between 90,400 years and 89,000 years in the central region of what you called Atlantis, originally in the astral field and in physicality. The endpoint was actually an astral portal that was sustained in a major temple and forming pyramids built by the ancient elders of that culture. This point was called Edsia, which was named after the capital of Orvan. This administrative and technological capital Edsia of Atlantis held actually a connection of various portals and underground tickets in other parts of the Earth. It was by that point where most of the ships came to the terrestrial orb, entering the 3D reality. This portal is related to what you now call the 11 to 11. Therefore, beings from another dimensionality entered 6D heights for 3D through energy densification of this Edsia portal. For this reason exiles and other people came for him. From it the formatting of the cryogenic body and preparation of earthly bodies and the genetic material in the astral was co-created and formatted by the karmic board of the Earth, we called the Council of Elders Earth. They had and still have the qualifications to carry out the study and preparations for the exiles entered the samsara wheel incarnational, both in human physicality, as other forms of life on Earth and in the astral plane. In addition to the Chappell of the group, at the same time the Earth received Boronic of exiles, a planet belonging to influence Syria nearby that could be considered Sirius Kappa, who was an advanced colony of genetic and technological research, which housed a civilization nearly 17 million inhabitants. There are about 3.5 million years of the Earth count. This colony was formed by beings 6D of the 7D, but we had many problems with the phenomena of Antares convergence, causing political and racial order serious interference. The dual gradient began to generate very complex conditions, which eventually produced a surplus of exiled beings to Earth at different times, but the mark of 87,000 years land they sent to Earth about 1.2 million 5D exiles to give continuity to their search for co-creation in harmonious with magism and sensory technology. Here we have the arrival of stinkfly origin beings, and some of reptilian descendants partly eventually enter the human incarnational cycle of the Earth, and a great deal left for incarnational cycle of telluric cities and inner Earth also of reptilian race. These beings eventually interact in many ways with Capellinos, and this created many disorder and wars within the Earth's cycle, because they fought for power and possession of materiality. They called themselves part of warlords and magic, had a high knowledge of energy plans and spirituality and Boronic, plus an excellent involvement with the Deva kingdom, and this eventually led to many lines of communication with spirituality and the astral humanity. The confrontation with the Chappell of Beings, Chappell occurred because in the past had been an important cultural exchange center, and Boronic had had a deep relationship with this development as it relates to technological and cultural exchange. In fact, karmic situations were confronted on Earth by that group. Another group around 87,200 years, would come to Earth through the star Tau Ceti, which is nearby Whale constellation of about 12 light-years from Earth. This group was a warrior and had participated in clashes and misuse of military power and high techniques of guerrilla and torture. Were Mongoloid line of humanoid beings, that would be partly responsible for the rise of the Mongol race on Earth. They were experts regarding the technology of war and torture others. Were inserted by exile on Earth about 2.6 million of these beings that came from 4D. Also they went on availability of the Earth exiled beings of Sirius Beta, about 85,000 years land that had been negated by improper use of the high magic knowledge within the order of Melchizedek regarding Syrian's colonies, including the groups that should be careful evolution of Boronic. At the same time came the timeline 1 Maldek beings flow that had already been destroyed long before. Were nearly 2 million Maldek of beings who arrived from 5D to live within the Earth in human physicality, for the same portal. These beings of the human species, descendants of the former colonizers of Lyra, had as incarnational proposal on Earth, performing the continuity of the co-creator process within the rational development without emotions and learn the emotional relationship within the Earth. All of them were linked to a rational proposal very developed on the issue of technological power, and wanted to learn emotionality. As you can see, within that period the Earth received an energy charge, emotional and mental beings from other worlds. They had many issues to be worked out. The Earth's energy density turned out to fall a lot in this period, since all of them were to add the frequency barrier condition in lack of awareness in many respects. This created a blockage within the incarnational cycles. Thousands of souls who were already in the ascension process. The misuse of magic and spirituality power were made possible by the most incarnated rebel groups and the umbrellina structures.